When we look back at the American Civil War, it's easy to focus on the generals, the battles, and the political speeches. But what if the outcome was decided long before the first shot was fired? What if the war was won not just on the battlefield, but in the factories, foundries, and mines of the North? This is the story of how industrial might became the ultimate weapon. Let's travel back to 1860, the year before the conflict erupted. America was a nation of stark contrasts. The South was a sprawling agrarian society, its economy almost entirely dependent on agriculture, particularly cotton. Its identity was tied to the land. The North, however, was on a completely different trajectory. It was in the throes of an industrial revolution, a humming, clanking, smoke-belching powerhouse. The numbers are staggering and paint a picture of two entirely different worlds. By 1860, the North was responsible for over 90% of the entire nation's industrial output. 90%. This wasn't just a slight edge. It was an overwhelming, almost absolute dominance. Think about what that 90% actually means. It means the fabric for the uniforms, the leather for the boots, the iron for the tools, and the machinery to make it all. While the South was cultivating fields, the North was building factories. This created a fundamental economic imbalance that would have profound consequences. The North's economy was diversified, dynamic, and capable of mass production on a scale the South could only dream of. The South's agrarian economy, for all its wealth in cotton, lacked the infrastructure and the skilled labor force needed to support a modern war effort. It was a society built for export, not for self-sufficient industrial production. This disparity wasn't just a background detail. It was the central, unavoidable reality that would shape every aspect of the coming conflict. The North entered the war with a built-in advantage that was almost insurmountable, a foundation of industrial supremacy that would ultimately prove decisive. One of the most critical areas where this industrial gap became glaringly obvious was in the production of weapons. A soldier is only as effective as the rifle in his hands, and an army is only as strong as its ability to arm and rearm its troops. Here, the North's advantage was nothing short of staggering. The Union had a well-established industrial base for manufacturing firearms, anchored by legendary institutions like the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts. This government-run facility was a marvel of its time, a pioneer in mass production techniques. Alongside it were powerful private firms that became household names. Colt, with its revolutionary revolvers, and Remington, with its reliable rifles. These factories weren't just workshops. They were massive industrial complexes capable of churning out rifles, pistols, and cannons with an efficiency that was unheard of. They could implement standardized, interchangeable parts, which meant repairs were faster and easier on the battlefield. Now, let's look south. The Confederacy, by contrast, had very few facilities capable of producing modern weaponry. Places like the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond were exceptions, heroic in their efforts, but ultimately overwhelmed. They struggled to get the raw materials, they lacked the skilled machinists, and they simply couldn't match the sheer volume of the North. To put it in perspective, for every one firearm the Confederacy managed to produce, the Union produced 32. Let that sink in, a 32-to-1 ratio. This meant the North could not only equip its massive armies from the start, but could also easily replace losses of weapons and ammunition throughout the long, grueling years of war. Southern soldiers often had to rely on captured Union weapons or outdated muskets imported from Europe. This firearms gap was a constant, nagging vulnerability for the Confederacy and a powerful, reliable strength for the Union. The war was, in many ways, a contest between a craftsman's workshop and an industrial assembly line, and the assembly line was destined to win. So, what fueled this incredible industrial engine of the North? The answer lies deep within the earth. The foundations of 19th century industry were built onto critical natural resources, coal and iron ore, and the North had them in abundance. The vast coal fields of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Illinois provided the energy to power the steam engines, heat the forges, and keep the factories running 24 hours a day. Coal was the lifeblood of the Industrial Revolution. It was to the 1860s what oil is to us today, the essential fuel that makes everything else possible. The South, on the other hand, had very limited coal deposits that were developed at the time. Then there was iron. From the rich iron ore ranges of the Great Lakes region, particularly in Michigan and Minnesota, came the raw material for building a modern war machine. This iron ore was transported via a network of canals and railways to the foundries of cities like Pittsburgh. There, in the blistering heat of the furnaces, it was smelted into pig iron and then forged into steel. This iron and steel became everything. It became the barrels of the cannons that pounded Confederate fortifications. It became the rifles for the infantry. It became the armor plating for the new ironclad warships that would revolutionize naval warfare. And perhaps most importantly, it became the railroad tracks that crisscrossed the northern states. These tracks were the arteries of the Union war effort, allowing the rapid movement of troops, supplies, and raw materials from the factories to the front lines. The North's control over these essential resources gave it the ability to build and sustain its military infrastructure on a scale the resource-poor Confederacy could never hope to replicate. It was a war of resources as much as a war of men, and the North held all the valuable cards. How do you sustain a massive army spread across a continent-sized battlefield? For the Union during the American Civil War, the answer was a masterpiece of logistics. A less glamorous, but utterly decisive factor in their eventual victory, it wasn't just about winning battles. It was about getting men and material to the fight and keeping them supplied once they were there. The Union's ability to do this, compared to the Confederacy's struggles, created a gap that grew wider with each passing year of the war. At the heart of this logistical supremacy was the railroad. Imagine a vast iron web stretching across the northern states. The Union boasted an incredible 22,000 miles of railway track, more than double the Confederacy's roughly 9,000 miles. This wasn't just a number, it was a strategic superhighway. While Confederate armies often had to march long, grueling distances, the North could rapidly shuttle entire armies, their cannons, their ammunition, and their food from one theater of war to another. A soldier in Virginia could be redeployed to Tennessee in a matter of days, not weeks. This mobility gave Union commanders immense flexibility, allowing them to concentrate forces and respond to threats with unprecedented speed. But what happened when the Confederates, knowing this advantage, tore up the tracks? This is where the Union's industrial and engineering might truly shone. The Union military railroads became masters of reconstruction. They were a dedicated corps of engineers and laborers who followed the armies, their sole purpose to repair and maintain the vital rail lines. When Confederate raiders like Nathan Bedford Forrest or John Hunt Morgan would launch daring attacks, burning bridges and ripping up rails, it seemed like a major blow. But almost as quickly as the Confederates left, the Union repair crews would arrive. They developed innovative techniques, like prefabricating bridge sections, to get the lines running again, sometimes in a matter of hours or days. The famous Sherman's neckties, where Union troops would heat rails and twist them around trees to make them unusable, was a tactic the Confederates simply couldn't counter with the same speed or resources. This relentless repair work meant that the logistical lifeline to the front was rarely severed for long. It was a constant, grinding effort that demoralized the South while ensuring a steady flow of everything. The Union armies needed to keep fighting, but trains can only get you so far. Once the supplies reached the forward depots, who was responsible for getting them into the hands of the individual soldier? This was the domain of the quartermaster corps, the unsung heroes of the Union war effort. Overseen by the brilliant and meticulous quartermaster General Montgomery Meigs, this organization was the logistical engine that powered the entire military machine. Their task was monumental in scale. They were responsible for acquiring, storing, and distributing every single item a soldier needed, aside from his weapon. Think about that for a moment. Food for hundreds of thousands of men, day in and day out. The iconic blue wool uniforms, millions of them, tents, blankets, shoes, canteens, and cooking pots, and it didn't stop there. The Quartermaster Corps was also responsible for all Army transportation that wasn't on a rail line. This meant procuring and caring for hundreds of thousands of horses and mules, building and maintaining thousands of wagons, and hiring the teamsters to drive them under Meade's leadership. The department was a model of efficiency and, for its time, remarkable integrity. He established a system of depots and supply chains that stretched from the factories at farms of the North all the way to the front lines. While Confederate soldiers were often marching barefoot, wearing tattered clothes, and subsisting on meager rations of parched corn, their Union counterparts were generally the best fed, best clothed, and best equipped army in the world at that time. This disparity had a profound impact on morale and combat effectiveness. A well-fed soldier can march farther and fight harder than a starving one. A soldier with sturdy shoes and a warm coat can endure a winter campaign that would cripple an ill-equipped force. The work of the quartermaster corps wasn't glorious, but it was absolutely essential. By ensuring the material well-being of the troops, they allowed generals like Grant and Sherman to focus on strategy and tactics. Confident that the logistical backbone of their armies would hold firm, this steady, reliable supply system was a weapon in its own right, grinding down the Confederacy's ability to resist. The Union's logistical dominance wasn't confined to land. At sea, its naval supremacy played an equally crucial role, primarily through the implementation of the Anaconda Plan. Conceived by General-in-Chief Winfield Scott at the beginning of the war, the plan was a grand strategic blockade of the entire southern coastline, stretching over 3,500 miles. From Virginia to Texas, initially mocked as too passive, the Anaconda Plan evolved into a logistical chokehold that slowly but surely strangled the Confederacy. The Union Navy, which expanded dramatically during the war, systematically captured key southern ports and established a patrol of warships offshore. The goal was twofold. First, it was to prevent the Confederacy from exporting its primary cash crop, cotton. Without cotton sales to Europe, particularly to Britain and France, the Confederacy was starved of the hard currency it desperately needed to finance its war effort. No money meant no ability to purchase weapons, medicine, or other essential manufactured goods from abroad. The second objective was the direct consequence of the first, to block those very imports. The South had very little industrial capacity of its own. It relied on imports for almost everything, from rifles and cannons to printing presses and locomotive parts. While daring blockade runners did manage to slip through the Union cordon, especially early in the war, it was a risky and increasingly difficult business. As the Union Navy tightened its grip, the flow of goods into the Confederacy slowed to a trickle. The blockade was, in essence, a weapon of economic and logistical warfare. It exacerbated the South's existing shortages and magnified the North's industrial advantage. While Union factories were churning out supplies at an ever-increasing rate, the Confederacy was cut off from the world, forced to rely on its own meager resources. This naval strategy, working in concert with the railroad network and the quartermaster corps, created a comprehensive, logistical system that the Confederacy simply could not match. It ensured that the material gap between the two sides would not only persist, but grow into an insurmountable chasm, ultimately sealing the fate of the Confederacy. In the closing years of the American Civil War, the nature of the conflict underwent a profound transformation. The focus shifted from single, decisive battles to a grinding, brutal war of attrition. This strategic change was orchestrated by Union generals Ulysses S. Grant and William T. Sherman, who recognized that the North's greatest weapon was its overwhelming superiority in industry, logistics, and manpower. They crafted a strategy designed to leverage these advantages to their fullest extent, aiming not just to defeat the Confederate armies on the field, but to crush the Confederacy's very capacity to wage war. This new approach was methodical and relentless, targeting the economic and psychological foundations of the Southern war effort. It was a recognition that modern warfare was evolving, and that victory would belong to the side that could outlast and overwhelm its opponent. Through sheer material strength, the final campaigns of the war were therefore not just military operations. They were calculated assaults on the entire structure of the Confederacy, designed to bring the long and bloody conflict to an undeniable conclusion. General Ulysses S. Grant, upon assuming command of all Union armies in 1864, implemented a strategy that fundamentally changed the endgame of the Civil War. He understood a grim but essential truth: the Union could afford to lose men and material at a rate that the Confederacy simply could not match. His strategy of attrition was a direct application of this numerical and industrial advantage. Grant didn't seek a single, spectacular victory like Napoleon might have. Instead, he aimed to engage Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia continuously, relentlessly, and simultaneously across multiple fronts. His overland campaign in Virginia was a testament to this philosophy. Battles like the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, and Cold Harbor were horrifically costly for both sides. Union casualties were staggering, leading many in the North to label Grant a butcher. But Grant never wavered. He knew that while his army was taking heavy losses, they could be replaced. Fresh troops and new supplies were constantly flowing south from the bustling factories and cities of the North. In contrast, every Confederate soldier lost was an irreplaceable blow to Lee's dwindling forces. Grant was systematically bleeding the Confederacy dry, trading casualties in a grim arithmetic that heavily favored the Union. He was destroying the Confederate Army not just with bullets, but with relentless pressure and an inexhaustible supply chain. While Grant was grinding down Lee's army in Virginia, General William T. Sherman was preparing to deliver a different, yet equally devastating, blow to the heart of the Confederacy. Sherman, a key subordinate and close confidant of Grant, fully embraced the concept of total war. He believed that to win, the Union had to destroy the South's will and ability to fight, and this meant targeting its economic and logistical infrastructure. After capturing the critical rail hub of Atlanta in September 1864, Sherman embarked on his infamous March to the Sea. This was not a traditional military campaign aimed at engaging a specific enemy army. Instead, his 60,000 soldiers cut a 60-mile-wide path of destruction across Georgia. From Atlanta to the port city of Savannah, they were an army of destruction, systematically dismantling the infrastructure that supported the Confederate war effort. Railroads were a primary target. Soldiers would heat the rails over massive bonfires and then twist them around trees, creating what became known as Sherman's neckties. This made it impossible for the South to move troops, food, or supplies. Factories were burned, bridges were destroyed, and telegraph lines were cut, isolating communities and severing communication. Sherman's march was a direct assault on the economic backbone of the Confederacy. Beyond destroying military and industrial targets, his forces also engaged in widespread foraging, a policy officially known as living off the land. In practice, this meant confiscating or destroying vast quantities of food, livestock, and crops from farms and plantations, while Sherman issued orders to spare private homes. The line was often blurred, and the devastation was immense. The psychological impact of this campaign was just as significant as the material damage. It demonstrated to the Southern people that their government could no longer protect them. The sight of a powerful Union army marching unopposed through their heartland, destroying everything in its path, was a crushing blow to civilian morale. It broke the will of many to continue the fight, as the promise of Confederate victory seemed more distant and hopeless than ever. Sherman's campaign was a stark illustration of modern economic warfare. He wasn't just defeating an army, he was crippling the nation's ability to sustain itself, proving that the home front was now a legitimate and decisive theater of war. The fall of Savannah in December was followed by a similar march of destruction northward through the Carolinas, compounding the damage and accelerating the Confederacy's collapse. Ultimately, the American Civil War became a test of endurance, a conflict decided not by tactical brilliance on any single day, but by the long-term capacity to sustain a massive war effort. The South, with its agrarian economy and limited industrial base, fought with incredible valor and resourcefulness. For a time, the tactical genius of generals like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson allowed them to punch far above their weight, achieving stunning victories against larger Union forces. However, they were fighting a losing battle against the forces of industrial modernity. The North's victory was a triumph of its economic and organizational might. It was a victory forged in the factories of Pittsburgh and the shipyards of Boston, as much as on the battlefields of Gettysburg or Vicksburg. The Union's ability to manufacture rifles, cannons, and uniforms on a massive scale was a decisive advantage. Its extensive railway network allowed for the rapid deployment of troops and supplies, giving its armies a mobility and logistical support that the South could never hope to match. The Union's financial system, though strained, proved robust enough to fund the enormous costs of the war, while the Confederacy's economy crumbled under the weight of the Union blockade and rampant inflation. This demonstrated a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare. The factory, the rail line, and the supply depot had become just as crucial as the fort or the trench. The Civil War was a brutal lesson that in the modern era, victory belongs to the nation that can best mobilize its entire industrial, economic, and human resources for a sustained conflict. It was a war of endurance, and in the end, the industrial giant of the North simply outlasted the agrarian South.